Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see everyone. Especially happy to have our new visitor with us today. Thank you for coming to be with us, Karen. I got that right, didn't I? Yes, very good. We're glad that you're here. I don't know if Penny has given you kind of a backdrop to the class. Have you informed her at all? Have you informed your cousin at all as to what we're talking about in this class? Okay. Sort of a little bit. Okay, very good.
Not too much though, or she's still with Kelly.
Oh. I'm not even. You can fill her in later. I'm just going to jump right into it. We have a lot actually today, and I'd really like to get through it in one class, so we don't have to break it up. So we'll just get started. Today's class is really going to just be as brief as I can make it. A brief history of feminism. Kind of where feminists put its beginning and kind of how we see it today in our culture. So we're just going to get started with that. I did go ahead and put up on the board the key women in history who played a part in where we are today as far as feminism goes.
Do you mind if I take a picture?
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine.
Rather than recopy it?
Yes, all of this is actually... They're all mentioned. This, in case, this was the homework last week, to read chapters 3 through 7, because all of this information that I'm going to give you today is in there. But I've done my own research, so I've added bits here and there, and we'll talk about those. Yep, so we're just going to go here in order. So first, Mary Wollstonecraft. You see her dates there. She did not live for very long. From what I read, she was the child of a father who eventually became abusive to her mother later in life. And as a result of that, that's kind of what prompted her to leave her home. Now, you think about this date when she lived. Women didn't do that. They didn't leave their home unless they got married or went to work somewhere reputable, and that's kind of what she did. She looked for something that was reputable, and she got out of her home that way. While doing that, she first became known for a publication that she wrote in 1790. It was a written response to another publication that a man had written about the French Revolution. He was all for it, she was all against it, and so she wrote about that. And that kind of propelled her into the public eye initially. I'm going to quote this as something that she said because there's a word in there that is kind of important. So she was an advocate for the French Revolution, and she called it a, quote, glorious chance to obtain more virtue and happiness than hitherto blessed our globe. If you're not familiar with the French Revolution, it was all about bringing down the aristocracy, the monarchy, and establishing more of a republic, a government for the people, by the people kind of thing. And so she was for that. But the word I want to focus in on in that quote is virtue. Virtue was her aim. That was, she uses that word a lot in the things that she wrote. But I'm not entirely sure what she meant by it. So it was kind of, I don't know. But she used it a lot, and we'll see it pop up here again. Well, so that propelled her into the public eye, but then she became best known for another publication that she wrote, and this time it was in 1792, and this was called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, with strictures on political and moral subjects. Here, she listed a few things out. First of all, she said in this publication, women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because of a lack of education. Okay, she was a big proponent for education. Women being able to be educated the same as men. She also said women are essential to the nation because they educate its children. Okay, and because they can be now companions to their husbands rather than just mere wives. She also said that both men and women should be treated as rational beings, and on the grounds of reason, that's how social order is founded. All right? Now, here's a pretty lengthy quote by her, and I've debated on whether or not to read it. I mean, this was written in the 1790s, so you can imagine, and it was written in Europe. She's from Europe. So you can imagine it's a little wordy, and we don't really speak this way, but basically she said, let it not be concluded that I wish to invert the order of things. So in other words, she wasn't trying to upset the apple cart as far as men and women and their roles in that sense. She says, I have already granted that from the constitution of their bodies, men seem to be designed by providence to attain a greater degree of virtue. There's her word again. Not entirely sure what that means, but she says, I do speak collectively of the whole sex. I don't see any reason why we should conclude that their virtues should differ in respect to their nature, right? In fact, and this is her argument for it, she says, in fact, how can their virtues differ in respect to their nature when they all come from the same God, is what she says. So I don't know that I necessarily disagree with any of those things that she said in there, but you see the word virtue, she uses that a lot, and I'm not entirely sure what she meant by that. But anyway, so she was a little ambiguous sometimes in her ideas, but during her lifetime, that publication was very well received, very well received. So in a nutshell, she pushed for the education of women. That was her MO. It's also, though, important to note that she was an advocate of free love. And she lived her life accordingly. She died in 1797, just less than 2 weeks after giving birth to her daughter, which is Mary Shelley, the next woman up here on this list. And following her death, her husband, William Godwin, who was also a proponent of free love and actually considered to be one of the founding fathers of anarchism, he was wanting to publish a memoir of her life. And he wanted to include all of the sordid details of her life. Of course, he didn't think of them as sordid, but he wanted to include all the details, but his editor was like, don't do it, don't do it. But he did it. So her memoir included her close friendships with women, her love affairs, her illegitimate child, her suicide attempts, and her rather agonizing death. That memoir did not sit well with the public at that time, as you can imagine. And so it tarred her reputation for about 100 years. She just wasn't held up anymore as she was while she was alive. So that all that said, can you and I disagree with her, at least her, what she was pushing for as far as equality for women in education? Can we disagree with any of that? That's kind of a good thing, right? That's a good thing, right? We think that men and women should have equal opportunity for education. That's a good thing. Now, you and I don't agree with her lifestyle by any means, but why do you suppose today's feminists have her on that list? Is it because of what she was pushing, or because of her rebellious lifestyle?
I think it was because of her lifestyle.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah.
That's what I tend to think too. Now, under the guise of education for women, I think that's kind of what, and we're going to see a trend here with that. So that was Mary Wollstonecraft. She gave birth to Mary Shelley. You may have heard that name if you've heard of the book Frankenstein. That's who wrote it, as Mary Shelley. She lived a little longer than her mother, but she, before, well, she's best known for that book, but she's also well known because she married a poet, Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley. You may have heard of him. He's a poet, philosopher. But anyway, he was actually from a family that had money, a very wealthy family, but he refused any of it because of his philosophical ideas, and he kind of lived a pauper's life. He didn't want to have anything to do with that. But anyway, she was 16 when she began an affair with him. He was 21. He was married. But Mary began an affair with him at 16. He was a friend of her father's. He agreed a lot with her father's economic philosophies. And from what I've read, apparently her dad, which is surprising, her dad wasn't really on board with this relationship. I'm not entirely sure for whatever reason, considering he was a big free love proponent. You'd think that was kind of contradictory. And she didn't understand it either, apparently. But she pursued this, and at 18 they married after his wife committed suicide, and so then they married. And their saga, their life, was pretty dramatic. They weren't married for very long because he died unexpectedly, but for about 6 years, their life was filled with, as you can imagine, suspected affairs, pregnancies, 3 children who died in infancy, depression, estrangement, reconciliation. It was a drama-filled life, and not for very long. Percy died in a boating accident, so they weren't married for very long, within like 6 years. But she was the product of parents who believed in immorality, right, and lived their lives according to that, so she followed suit. Interestingly, though, her writings tend to focus on the role of the family in society, which is unique, and then the woman's role in that family. I have a quote here, she celebrates the feminine affections and compassion associated with the family and suggested that civil society would fail without them. So that's interesting. Okay. After her husband's death, she had one living child, a son, and after her husband died, she devoted her life to his education and then to publishing her husband's memoirs. That's how she spent the rest of her life. But of course, then we ask the question here, why is she on this list? All right. She seemed to promote motherhood and home, the virtue of that and how it contributes to society. But I don't know if that's why she's on this list. Do you? I tend to think she's on this list because of her rebellion, her moral rebellion. Yes?
I know that she was friends with, her and her husband were friends with Lord Byron, who
Right.
at the time was famous, but was also a sexual deviant. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
think
They had quite the circle.
Exactly. So people kind of looked up to that group, thought they were the cool ones.
Maybe
you know.
so. Yes, but the point is, modern feminism puts her in there, not necessarily, I don't think, because of what she was pushing in society as far as her ideals, but because of her rebellion, her moral
I think
immorality.
everybody on the list is going to be the
Uh-huh.
opposite of our list,
Yes.
because they have to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they don't want anybody who would.
Yep, that's the
without
trend
our
we're going to see.
list. Yeah.
Yes, that is definitely the trend we're going to see. Okay, so next, 1820 to 1906, Susan B. Anthony. We all heard her before. She's been in our history books, and since
She's got a coin from
school,
her.
she's got her
She's got a
face
coin.
on a coin. That's exactly right. She was actually raised a Quaker, but her family pretty quickly jettisoned all that. It was pretty strict, you know. Quakers are pretty strict. They jettisoned all that, and she eventually became associated with a group called the Unitarians. Now, the best, unless you know, does anybody know what a Unitarian is? The best I can tell, the Unitarians were a pretty ambiguous group. They kind of just accepted anybody and everything, whatever you believed, even if you didn't believe in God, you were in their group, and I'm not sure how they worshipped or what they did, but that's who she eventually became associated with. They were really, I guess, more about social reform than spiritual things. Right. Okay. Well, her friend is, you know, if you've read these chapters, her good friend was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they worked side by side. Right. Well, Elizabeth called Susan an agnostic. That's how she thought of her. You know, an agnostic is somebody who thinks you just can't even know if there's a God or not. And so Elizabeth called Susan an agnostic. Anthony herself said, this is what Susan B. Anthony said, work and worship are one with me. I cannot imagine a God of the universe made happy by my getting down on my knees and calling him great. So that really reflects her attitude toward God, deity, supreme being. Nope. She wasn't going to have any of that. Of course, as you know, she never married. She never had any children. She lived her life fully devoted to three main issues. Remember what they were?
I remember.
Abolition. She was a huge abolitionist. To women's suffrage, which is,
Yes,
you know, of
suffrage,
course,
I knew
giving
that.
women the right to vote. And then temperance was the
No
third
liquor.
one. Yeah, so she devoted her life fully to those three causes. I learned that when she first began campaigning for women's rights, she was harshly ridiculed by the public because they thought that she was trying to destroy the institution of marriage. But eventually the public accepted her and changed their perception of her. And for her 80th birthday, she was even invited to the White House by President McKinley. In her lifetime, though, she only got to see one of those tenets, the success of one of those. She got to see the abolition of slavery. That happened in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. But it was after she had already died in 1920 that the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, that's when Prohibition was established, which, by the way, that's the only amendment that's been repealed in 1933. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment, where women were given the right to vote. But because, of course, of her extensive efforts, she is lauded. And she did a lot of work. She really did. And she became the first female citizen on U.S. coinage. We know that. And it was, that dollar coin was released in 1979, which is an interesting date when you think about it, because we're going to get to the 70s here. But she appeared as the first woman on a coin in the late 70s. Why do you think, it's pretty obvious why we would put her up, and if we were going to think of somebody who was really working for women's rights, and, you know, in the feminist camp. Yeah, we could see why she makes this list. And she was working for things that you and I aren't really opposed to. I don't think anybody here is opposed to women not, you know, women voting or, you know, the abolition of slavery. Those are all good things. And we would agree with those things, and we would have been on board with her in those areas. And so I could see why she might be able to make this list, but, you know, maybe the feminists aren't so much focused on that part as maybe they are on her lifestyle. Even though she didn't seem out overtly immoral, I never got any indication anywhere that she was loose or, you know, anything like that.
Extra dedicated to the cause.
Yeah, she was fully dedicated to the cause, but she did not believe in God. She, you know, and that was a rare thing. And she wasn't shy about it, I don't guess. But anyway, so, you know, she's on the list. But just something to think about. Next, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, cohort with Susan B. Anthony. She was married and had several children, so she couldn't travel as much as Susan could. But like you read in your book, she kind of wrote the speeches and Susan delivered those. She was on the same page with Anthony as far as all of those tenets go: abolishing slavery, getting women the right to vote, and temperance. She was on the same page as Susan B. Anthony on all of those. She did take a slightly different approach to religion. I don't know if it's worse. It's definitely not better, but I don't know if it's worse. But she took a little slightly different approach. She said at one point that I get more radical as I get older, while she seems to grow more conservative. This is said in response to Susan B. Anthony came into fellowship, I guess, I don't know what word you want to put there. I don't even know what I put here in my notes. Oh, formed an alliance with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, okay, which was at the time the nation's largest women's organization. They were also a supporter of women's suffrage. As you remember in the book, those kind of things kind of went hand in hand, all those. Now, I'm not sure that Anthony was a supporter or formed that alliance because of her own beliefs. Obviously, she didn't even believe in God, but I think probably because she was looking, whoever's going to join, I'll take whoever, right? But Elizabeth was more like, well, that's when she said, I get more radical as I get older, while she, Susan, seems to grow more conservative. So she was didn't like that Susan was forming this alliance with more conservative groups, right? Okay. So that gives you a little insight into Elizabeth Stanton, who was maybe a little more rebellious than Susan. Here's another example. When Elizabeth married in 1840, she omitted the word obey from her vows. Later, she wrote, I obstinately refused to obey one with whom I supposed I was entering into an equal relation. That was uncommon, right? And then here's the real kicker. In 1895, this was toward the end of her life, Stanton published the Woman's Bible, which attacked the use of the Bible to relegate women to an inferior status. It was, as you can imagine, highly controversial, but it was a bestseller. So, all that said, would you think of her as a little more radical than Susan B. Anthony?
Yes.
I mean, they both jettisoned God, clearly. Of course, maybe Stanton believed at least there was a God. I don't know, but she didn't like what he had to say. Apparently, obviously, she wrote her own Bible for women. But of course, modern feminists hail her as a hero for the cause of feminism, right? I think because of the same reasons as Anthony, she did promote and worked her life to secure these rights for women and abolish slavery and etc. But at the same time, she was very rebellious. We see a trend here of rebellion, don't we? Okay, yeah. Okay, next is Margaret Sanger. She comes a little closer into our day and time, some of us anyway. The book said that she was born to atheist socialist parents. I don't know if you remember that. I didn't find that. I found that her mother was Catholic. I found that in a couple of places actually, and that her father was a freethinker who later turned into an atheist. So maybe that's what she meant by that. But anyway, she didn't come from a totally non-religious background. Her mother was Catholic, and she remained Catholic actually for a while, and then eventually became Episcopalian. That's where her funeral was and everything like that. So she became associated with the Episcopalians eventually. But she first became a teacher when she was young. Her mother had tuberculosis and suffered quite severely with that. And it wasn't until after taking care of her mother at the end of her mother's days that she decided that she was going to go into medicine and nursing, and she I guess was maybe going to be a doctor, but then eventually just became a nurse. But she also, she did that after her mother died. So she took care of her mother, and then after her mother died, that's when she decided to pursue nursing. So she did that, but she too suffered from tuberculosis. Her mother had 11 surviving children, but apparently was pregnant like 18 times. And Margaret had 3 children. Now there's a little bit of conflicting reports about her personal ideas for family and things like that. I've read where at one point, because she saw her mother and that huge family that they had, that she came from, where she equated large families with unhappiness, but small families with happiness. But then there was one, resource that said that she personally wanted a larger family, but she couldn't due to her tuberculosis. And then one source said that she blamed her father for her mother's death because she had so many kids. She was pregnant so many times, and she died at, like 48 or something. So, there's that to consider. She continued after her mother passed. She became a nurse. She continued that work. She joined the Socialist Party during all of that. While working as a nurse, she worked in actually some of the poorest areas of New York and witnessed some things that shocked her. And that's kind of what started her path toward birth control, right? Okay, trying to figure out some way to help these women because they were either performing abortions on themselves or getting, of course, those were illegal, or looking for somebody else to do them, and, they didn't make it or they didn't survive, and, so she saw, the ugly side of that kind of thing. And so that prompted her to do something about it. She wanted to do something about it. So she began studying material from various libraries about contraceptives, and she eventually traveled to France because that's where they were widely used as opposed to anywhere else in the country, in the world, I guess, at the time anyway. So she traveled there with her husband or children to learn about their contraceptive methods. On her way back to the States, but this time without her husband, they eventually divorced. This is when she settled on the term birth control. So if you've ever said those words, you can contribute that to her. She coined those words. And she started her magazine called The Woman Rebel. All right. So she lived the rest of her life advocating for the legality of birth control and sex education in order to help women to be able to control the sizes of their families. But that was not her only MO. She was also a firm believer, and this she learned while she was in Europe, she was also a firm believer that this globe was in danger, that there was a serious threat to it becoming overly populated. And then its resources were going to be too thin to supply for the population overgrowth. And so she's promoting contraceptives for that purpose also. She also was an advocate of eugenics. Okay, you know what that is, right? No. Eugenics is when you're controlling the population by only allowing or you're preventing the lower classes from populating, having children. She was an advocate for that. That was a pretty common idea, actually, way back then. Of course, after Hitler, that kind of changed. Okay, so she determined that contraceptives would help curb the proliferation of the lesser classes. All right. She did face a constant uphill battle from the get-go. I mean, it wasn't easy. Anything she did was not easy because it was illegal, first of all, to import contraceptives into this country. And it was even illegal to distribute information about them through the mail. There was something called the Comstock Act that prohibited that. There were other laws that prohibited those things. So she violated those laws several times. She spent time in jail, but that didn't stop her. She continued on her quest. That was early on. We fast forward in her life to 1942. This is a significant day in Margaret's life. This is when she established several birth control groups, and they eventually all merged into one called the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Okay, so come to find out, she wasn't even happy with that name change because it didn't focus on birth control. It focused on family planning, right? The phraseology was different. It was a little more user-friendly, right? Okay, she didn't like it. She didn't agree with that. But
Was that dressing up a pig?
yeah, but the Federation sought,
Lipstick on pig.
yeah, but the group sought to place greater emphasis on the benefits of planned families and less on contraceptives in order to make the organization more socially acceptable, to broaden its base, etc. And it worked. It very much worked. And she stayed on board with it, and it gained momentum, and she continued to work with that group towards her goals. I think it's important to note here that she was not an advocate of abortion, except when it was life-threatening to the mother. So she was okay with it then if the mother's life was in danger. And at that time, early on, those clinics strongly encouraged preventing life as opposed to destroying it. Okay? She did believe that if women had legal access to contraceptives, then the need for abortions would be eliminated. That's what I said. Okay. She died in 1966. In 1960, she did get to see that the first birth control pill was approved by the US FDA. So she did get to see that. She also got to see in 1965 that the Supreme Court dismantled the Comstock law, basically in one of their court cases, Comstock Act, along with other similar laws like that. So now it was perfectly legal to distribute and do anything through mail or import or whatever. Contraceptives were absolutely 100% legal. And beginning in 1965, 1966, she passed away. Of course, a few years later, 1973, Roe v. Wade happened, and that changed everything. Okay, so we asked the question again: why do feminists put her on this list? I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Yeah. She's on this list for pretty obvious reasons. I think it's important to note, though, that I even think she might be shocked at what's happened with her Planned Parenthood Federation, right? I think she would, I don't know, but I would think so, just from what I've read about her.
I can imagine why she would be. Some of her beliefs were.
She was out there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, there's a good case for that. Yes, she did think, of controlling the population, eugenics. That's.
But she probably, she might. I'm shocked every day. So. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. She might have been, she might not have been. But we can see why she's on this list. I mean, she did she paved the way for something nobody had ever done before. And that is provide women with the ability to have or not have children, I guess, and do it whenever they want to. And that presents a lot of new opportunities, new ideas and doors and things. So she paved the way for all of that. Next, we have Betty Friedan. Friedan?
Friedan.
I did read that her husband's name was Friedman, but they changed that. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So then it went to Friedan. Friedan. I wasn't alive when let's see.
Betty
Well, I don't remember her anyway.
Yeah, she was the least familiar to me.
Friedan. Okay, Betty Friedan. She just died a few years ago, 2006, but she was born to Jewish parents in Illinois. They were immigrants from Russia and Hungary. Her mother was a homemaker, and I get a little confused on this actually, but she was a homemaker, but it was either before she got married or before she had children, or it was while her husband, or when her husband got sick. At some point she was writing articles for newspapers, and she really enjoyed that and thrived and felt her fulfillment was there, and apparently that was easy to see because Betty saw that modeled by her mother. And so that's just something to stick back in there. While Betty was in school, she joined various Jewish groups. She also was a member of some Marxist groups. And it was in those Jewish circles that she first felt her calling to fight against social injustices, because there was some anti-Semitism happening, and she was feeling that, and so she kind of felt her calling there, I guess. She went on to college, and she found herself at University of California in Berkeley. She was there for a year. After that, she married, didn't stay married. She stayed married for over 20 years, but they eventually divorced. And she became a journalist for various publications. She was eventually let go, though, at one point because she was pregnant. Okay, well, that's something to remember. So she became a stay-at-home mom. And while she was at home, she was still writing, this time now for magazines. Here and there, Cosmopolitan, whatever. She was writing for magazines, doing freelance work. Well, her 15th year college reunion was coming up, and so she conducted a survey of the women in her class her survey focused on their education, and then their subsequent experiences after their education and their overall satisfaction with their lives. Okay? And with that information, she started publishing articles. I have a quote here. And she started publishing articles about what she called the problem that has no name. And then she got very passionate responses from the country, from the women in this country, about that article. And of course, that information, those articles and everything, she then put into one volume, which was that one book she's most famous for, Feminine Mystique. All right. She published that in 1963. I think I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the book, her book, but except for that, in this book, Rebecca Merkel quotes on page 62, I think, what is the gist of Betty's book. The gist is this: femininity to full human identity. That's what Betty said. And that's really what that whole book was about. You women are unfulfilled because you haven't found your full identity yet. Right? And her answer to that, how do you find your full identity as a woman, is, well, you go get a career outside your home. You leave that behind and you go get a career. Of course, in this book, if you read that chapter, Rebecca asked, did it work? No. And she proves that by, the use of antidepressants and everything. Everybody was unhappy. Nobody was happy anymore. Still, I guess, right? Okay, so it didn't work. That was pages 65 and 67 in this book, if you want to read that. So that was 1963. She wrote The Feminine Mystique. In 1966, she established an organization called NOW Now, National Organization for Women. This was, quote, to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. All right. Their first order of business was to have equality in the workplace, equal opportunity employment. Okay, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but anyway. So that was its initial MO, I guess, for lack of a better term. That's what they were fighting for. Okay, she also worked hard as a pro-choice advocate. But there are a couple publications later in her life that I think are rather interesting. Very interesting. In 1976, she published It Changed My Life. This book questioned the extreme feminists who were, in her opinion, missing the boat and advocating for things beyond the feminist movement, like sexual perversions, and that in doing that, you hinder the cause of feminism. That's Betty saying that. So by this time in 1976, she had witnessed extreme feminists. Okay, keep that in mind. And it wasn't what she planned, I guess, or the direction she was wanting to go, but women hopped on board and then started taking it to an extreme, and that was in 1976. In 1981, this is a good one. She published a second book, another book. She published several books, but this is another one, 1981, called The Second Stage. Here, she fully focuses on how the movement went astray. All right? Here in this book, she also was advocating for child care programs, parental leave, flexible work hours, and here she insisted that she was not for abortion, but for the choice to have children. Okay? I don't know entirely what she meant by that, but that's what she wrote. That's a direct quote in her book. She was not for abortion, but for the choice to have children. I have a pretty lengthy quote here that she didn't write this, but somebody else did, and I thought this sums up her thoughts in this book very well. She voiced her ongoing discomfort with new feminist ideologies. She argued for more balance within the women's movement itself, and she blamed radical elements in the movement who were distracted by sexual politics around the ideas of pornography and lesbianism, and they were the ones responsible for ignoring the real needs of women. And she said they were ignoring the real needs of most women for family and nurturing. She insisted that for the founding mothers of the women's movement, quote, equality and the personhood of women never meant destruction of the family, repudiation of marriage and motherhood, or an implacable sexual war with men. Okay, I think that's a phenomenal quote by her, because that is exactly what you're seeing today, right? It is, what we see today is extreme feminism. Extreme feminists, that's who you see on the TV, and they're shouting in your face, and they've got these bold signs with vulgarity. There is no discretion. And in 1981, she was seeing that already. Okay. She also wrote that the women's movement did not fail in the battle for equality. She was worried that she quoted it as the Feminist Mystique, not the feminine, but the Feminist Mystique, would keep women out of the home, repudiate the family, and alienate young women who hope to balance public lives with domesticity and motherhood.
There you go.
Isn't that interesting? But the feminists hold on to her still, don't they?
Well, because she set up Planned Parenthood, and they.
No, this is. No, that was Margaret.
Right.
This is
sorry,
Betty.
That's
Yes,
right. Betty, yeah.
she wrote the Feminine Mystique. Yeah, she's the one who got women out of the homes, basically, and into the working world.
Right. That's right.
Under the illusion that, or the delusion that was where their fulfillment was going to be found. Yes.
Right in the middle of that, Betty Friedan's life, they came out with the Masters and Johnson book.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
They have the pill.
Who did?
They.
Whoever wrote
They.
that. They is
Johnson's.
the
medicals.
the
Johnson
social.
Johnson?
No, not Johnson.
Oh.
Masters and Johnson was a how-to sexual book.
Oh.
A lot directed towards women, and you
Okay.
have the right of this, and you can do this, and you can do that. And that was, that came out in the middle of that in the 60s in my time.
Oh yeah, we
pill,
talked about the pill, 1966.
The pill.
63. Wait.
having your tubes tied became
Oh,
popular.
yeah.
Not vasectomies yet, because that was the man's part, but anyway.
1960, the pill became legal. Yes.
So all of that,
Yeah.
I think, tied in a lot. I think the women's sexual freedom tied into a lot of the other freedoms that came along with it. That they could go out and be like the man indiscriminately out there and do whatever it is that their hearts desired, thinking, this is what will make me happy.
Yeah, was it the 60s? Was that the sexual revolution? Is that what they called it?
I would
Oh,
think
yeah.
so,
Free love.
because right after that is when they started the hippies, free love, psychedelic, what's the drug? What's the drug? that- LSD. All of that
Yeah,
became
all tied into
all of it.
all
Yes.
tied into that, and the free love and the,
Woodstock era.
So the point we want to get, I think, as Christian women here from Betty Friedan's life is that she had a false idea, I think, when she wrote the Feminine Mystique anyway, but she definitely wasn't a proponent of what we're seeing today, and she recognized it in her lifetime that this was going astray, that these extreme feminists were missing the point here, and they're hindering the feminist movement, really, and what it was all about initially, by going to these extremes. And all of those extremes have to do with sexual perversions, don't they?
Yeah.
Absolutely they do. And that's what's being held on to today, right? That's what we see in our culture right now, 2023. That's what's being promoted. Everybody wants you to accept every sexual perversion out there. Almost. Now, we haven't got them all covered yet, but what's next?
They're working on it.
They're working on it. Yes. Okay, but before we get to what's next, let's, last one. Gloria Steinem, she's still alive. You all know her, I'm sure. She's very, very, very pro-abortion. She will fight tooth and nail for that, and has for a lot of years. And I think in her, you definitely see the epitome of what Betty was warning against. All right, but she's still on the list here, and you can see why. I mean, obviously why, but anyway. And as far as I can tell from everything I've read about Gloria Steinem, she pretty much upholds anything and everything that is against biblical morality and traditionalism. Whatever is against all that, she's holding on to that. And she is as feministic as a woman can get, I think. But anyway, and I think with her ushers in, and I don't remember if she called it this, she probably did, but kind of a third wave feminism. I know she called it a first wave, second wave. But with Gloria, I think, kind of ushered in this extreme feminism and this third wave feminism. But anyway, so now, where is the movement headed next? All right. Is it possible for feminism to get any worse? Probably. That's what I put in my notes. Probably. The first thing I thought of is the whole ERA. Have you heard of that? The Equal Rights Amendment?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's not an amendment yet. Did you know that was introduced in 1923? Right in the heart of these two, right? Okay. This amendment was not created by them, but was by another woman. But it fell apart. It was this close to eventually being ratified, not until the late 70s and early 80s, but one woman during that time in the late 70s, early 80s, Phyllis Schlafly, rallied conservative women across this country to oppose the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. She said, because if that amendment comes into play, you are going to lose more rights than you're going to gain. Because now, she said, she scared them basically. She said, because now you can be drafted. If you divorce, your children won't necessarily go to you. They could go to your ex-husband or whatever. There was another big one. I don't remember. Maybe I wrote it here. No, I didn't write it here. Anyway, so there was that. But so that's still sitting there. It's still just waiting to be ratified. Could it? possibly, which is kind of scary, if all that's true. So there's the ERI to think about. That would be worse. Then there's, what about the legalization of other sexual perversions? Okay, I don't have to go very far to gross us out. Bestiality. Why not make that legal?
They're working.
Pedophilia. I know they're working on pedophilia.
It's big already in the schools.
That was happening.
Yeah.
Okay,
Everywhere.
you and I, those are gross. And they're extreme to our minds. And we think, how could anybody ever think that those are good for humanity?
Because of an equal rights,
Yes.
equity, equality.
Yep.
Pedophiles are people too, is
Oh,
what they're
yeah.
saying.
What they say.
Yep.
And so it's this equity system of making sure that everybody has whatever rights they feel like they have. And that's why it's not so far off, because it's equity is being pushed from birth on until now,
Yep.
so that it seems normal to
Exactly.
the new crop of children coming up. Well, it's
Yep.
normal to accept anybody for whatever they do, but it starts way back there.
Yep. Very good. So it might seem impossible to stem this tide, but I don't think it is. I think that it is possible to, at least in our, it may seem impossible on a really grand scale, to begin a really like nationwide or even worldwide movement, but you and I can definitely stem it in our worlds, in our realm of influence. So what can we do about it? This is how we're going to end class. What can we do about this? First, I wrote here, make sure that your ideals don't match up with this culture's ideals of femininity. You have got to make sure that that's the case, that your thinking is not in line with this culture's ideas or thinking of femininity. This class is designed to help us reframe our thinking if we need to. It's also designed to further solidify the things we already know. Therefore, start being proactive against the ideologies of this culture. How can we do that? You have to keep in the Word. Keep your mind right. Keep your mind right. Be prayerful. Pray for yourself. Pray for the other women in your congregation, all of those women within your realm of influence. I say women, females, who may not even be women yet, right? But they're girls. And they're going to face this culture after you leave that's probably going to be a little worse than you had to face it. Pray for them. Stand up on social media for biblical morality. That's perfectly acceptable. It's not difficult to do. You don't have to be ugly. You
You'll
don't
lose
have
friends,
to be rude.
and that's
Oh,
okay.
yep.
Friends, in quotes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's good.
Yes.
It's a sifting.
Yes, it very
And
much
don't get
is.
into arguments, because that goes
For
nowhere.
sure.
And you don't have to. And you don't have
You
to.
don't.
But you can at least make your position known.
Or our belief.
Don't have to hide it.
Yeah.
So stand up on social media for biblical morality. Live moral and upright lives yourselves. Find fulfillment in your role as a woman, whether that's as a wife, as a mother, or both, a grandmother, an aunt. Any of those, you have, by virtue of being a woman, you have a role. Find your fulfillment in that and work hard at it. Okay, we did not talk about this, but why did Betty Friedan's experiment fail? Why did that whole idea fail? Or, no, not fail. Why was the nation's women as a whole during that time in the late 50s, early 60s discontent? Do you remember why? She spends a whole chapter on
She talked about
it.
depression and
Yes, but what led to that?
People look down
the
on
people.
me.
Wait.
No.
Okay, let me rephrase my question so you understand.
Yeah,
So Betty Friedan did that whole survey, right? And then she wrote the book based on her results of that. And because she found that women as a whole in this country were feeling unfulfilled. And this was the late 50s, early 60s. Chapter 6 is a wonderful chapter explaining why that happened.
Oh,
Because it was after World War II, a huge economic boom happened. Suburbia came into play, convenience came into play. Now you had all the gadgets, you had all the convenience, and so all of that took away a woman's hard
yeah,
work.
TV dinners and,
It
Yeah.
became
Yeah.
easy. So then it was the empty, how to be, you know,
yeah.
the role model wife for your husband, you know, make sure everything's dusted before he comes home and the kids are dressed and the table's set and the dinner's cooked and, you know, it's, you know, a little, it just wasn't, there wasn't anything there.
Monotonous.
Yeah, and
They
there
were-
wasn't any hard work happening there, and so no wonder
Yeah, you
women
can't look around
felt
and feel fulfilled when
yeah,
your microwave did the work and your dishwasher did it, and then you were like, well,
yep.
But
Yeah,
what's the
that's-
answer to
that's
that?
Okay, hold on. Well, I think the immediate answer to that is hard work. Now, you and I, we're very grateful for our conveniences. No
Yeah.
doubt
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are. I love my washing machine.
yeah.
Okay, I love my washing machine and my dryer. But that means that we have to work hard somewhere else. We have to be able to find what that is.
Mhm.
That's going to be different for each one of you.
Mhm.
Some women choose a career along with their domesticity, and they work hard at both of those things, because when you have a career and you're trying to work at home, that creates automatically hard work, right? But there can be other things. It could be your extra hard work when your children are at home, if they're in public school or if you're homeschooling. That's a lot of work. So work hard at that. But for you who don't have children, but maybe you have grandchildren or whatever it is, you have to find that, and that's where my point is right here. Work hard. Work hard. Find one or two or three or things and work really hard at those things. Stop being lazy. We are still very much a lazy country because of our conveniences. I highly suggest, if you're still able to travel, go to a third world country.
You need
It'll
to live
reshape
in
your
a third
thinking
world country
fast.
to appreciate what we have here, even at this point in time.
And maybe you go work hard in a third world country and another with, you know, for the Lord, of course. But maybe if that is something that appeals to you, by all means do it. Work hard. Vote intelligently. That was the next thing I had on here. Vote intelligently. Encourage Christ-centeredness in your home. You all have a home. Everybody does. Encourage Christ-centeredness in that home, whether you have other faithful people in your home or not. But you have the ability to create that. Stay informed. I don't know if you all are aware that there is an undercurrent beneath the prevailing voices of our culture. There is a current of people, men and women, who are on the front lines combating the idiocy that's out there. Find them online. If you want names, see me later, I'll throw some out to you, but read their books, listen to their podcasts, watch their YouTube lines, feed your mind with material that upholds biblical morality, a biblical worldview, biblical principles. There are a lot of great things outside of the Bible to read. Now, I'm not saying that there's, you know, better things in the Bible, but there are supplementary materials out there like this book that is very helpful to read in order to help us be better thinkers, to just kind of maybe pull our heads out of the sand a little bit and, you know, recognize where we are in this time. So there's a lot of books to read. There are things to watch, things to listen to that can help us grow our understanding of God, even not just our culture, but there are materials out there that really can grow your understanding of who God is, who you are, and your responsibility in the world that He created. There's a lot of great material out there. So those are just some suggestions about what do we do about it now, at least in this immediate today. What do we do? in our realms of influence, what can we do about it? The world's going to go where the world goes, right? It's always been that way, and it will continue to be that way. And but you and I can definitely, we don't have to go that direction, and we can work really hard at not going that direction by doing some of these things. Okay, so that's the end of this class. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, good, we did that in about an hour.
Thank you.
Well,
Excellent.
thank you. Next week we will look at feminism in Scripture. So bring your Bibles. We'll look at the Bible next week. We didn't crack that open today, but we will next week. What does the Bible say about it? So we'll do that. I do have a little bit of homework if you want to do it. It's just to get you thinking, because we will talk about some of these things along this line. The homework is to think about, when you think of the Bible, who in the Bible would you might consider a feminist?
Deborah.
Okay. So who in the Bible might be considered a feminist? And maybe it's not just women.
Is it Jezebel?
Yeah.
Maybe it's men in the Bible that would fit in the category. But anyway,
That's a modern day feminist.
so that's just to get us thinking. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about next week is feminism. And we know the word's not in there. It wasn't even a word until way back. But, the idea of feminism, what does the Bible say about it? Does the Bible say anything about it?
I think it's a shame that we are always overcorrecting that steering wheel. Like sometimes you can see in history, if you just stop right there.
I know, right?
Like right there. But we just keep
Yeah.
going and going with that overcorrection, and it's
People taking it to the extremes.
always.
Yeah. All right. Do you have something before we close? Okay. We're going to close with a prayer. Before we head out, we're going to have lunch next door. Woohoo. Would anybody in here like to offer a prayer at the end of our class?
I can say it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Pray with me. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again so much for the opportunity to come together and just continue to learn more about the way of the world as it is and what we can do to just stay in your word and be a light to others through the extreme things that happen in our lifetime. I ask so much that you please watch these women, help guide them in their homes, help guide them with their friends, their families, their children, their grandchildren, their husbands, anybody that they come in contact to show these people that we don't have to take everything to the extreme, that we can be wonderful women in your image. Thank you so much again for Veronica and her willingness to come teach us every week, and I just pray that she continues to enjoy doing this for us. Thank you again for your son and his sacrifice on the cross. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Hannah.
You're welcome. I hate that I cannot speak. No, I got a text